Most of us can name Washington, Lincoln, or Roosevelt, but dozens of presidents have quietly shaped America in ways history forgot. Beneath the grand speeches and famous portraits lie decisions, scandals, and innovations that barely made it into textbooks. Tonight, let's drift into the overlooked corridors of power and uncover the forgotten legacies of America's least remembered presidents. You know, history is funny sometimes. We remember the loud ones, the ones who shouted their way into the textbooks, the Lincolns, the Roosevelts, the Kennedys. They had big wars, big speeches, big mustaches, but the truth is, there were others. A long line of presidents who quietly sat in the same big chair, wore the same fancy suits, and made real decisions. Yet somehow, they disappeared into the shadows of history. They became what I like to call the quiet ghosts of the White House. You might have heard their names in passing: Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, Chester A. Arthur. Names that sound like they belong more in an old law firm than in the Oval Office. But these men once held the highest power in America, and somewhere between the wars, the revolutions, and the shiny modern headlines, we just stopped talking about them. Why? Well, that's what we're here to explore tonight. Slowly, gently, as we drift through America's forgotten corridors of power. Why some presidents fade away. Let's start with a small truth. History isn't fair. It's like a talent show. The loudest, flashiest acts always win. Presidents like Lincoln, Washington, and FDR became legends because their stories had drama. They fought wars, faced assassinations, made speeches that shook the world. Their stories are loud, cinematic, and full of fireworks. But for every Lincoln, there's a Rutherford B. Hayes, a man who worked hard, kept things stable, and didn't exactly scream Hollywood material. History looks at people like him and says, "Nice job, buddy," then quietly moves on, and that's how it goes. History rewards noise, not nuance. Now, some presidents fade because their time in office was calm. No wars, no revolutions, just boring peace and paperwork. And let's be honest, peace doesn't sell history books. Imagine a textbook chapter titled, "The Era of Everything Going Mostly Fine." No one's buying that, but those quiet years often shaped America in ways we forget. Small laws, small reforms, decisions that never made the front page but built the country brick by brick. The bias of fame and scandal. There's another reason some presidents get forgotten: the spotlight's unfair bias. See, fame and scandal are two sides of the same coin. Some presidents got lucky, their names attached to victory and greatness. Others got dragged into scandal or failure, and their legacy turned into a historical punchline. Take poor Warren G. Harding. The man loved poker, had a soft spot for his friends, and trusted a few too many shady ones. After his death, corruption scandals poured out, and now his name often shows up in worst presidents lists. But if you look closer, Harding also pushed for civil rights and freed political prisoners. You won't see that in the headlines, though. And then there's Franklin Pierce. Good-looking guy, kind heart, but unlucky life. He lost his children, struggled with grief, and tried to keep the nation together before the Civil War. He failed, yes, but it's hard not to feel for him. History tends to forget the human side and remember the fall. It's a strange game. If a president's story isn't epic or tragic, we move on. If it's tragic but not famous, we still move on. Basically, if it can't fit on a high school quiz or a movie poster, it gets swept under the rug. The history writers. Filter. Here's another thing we often forget. History isn't just about what happened. It's about who writes it. The historians of the 1800s and early 1900s decided which stories mattered most. They loved big speeches, great wars, and noble deaths. They wanted heroes, not administrators. So when they looked at presidents like John Tyler or Millard Fillmore, calm men, dealing with quiet times. They just didn't sparkle on the page. The storytellers of history gave them maybe a paragraph or two, and once the textbooks were printed, that was that. It's like a movie editor cutting out the quiet scenes because the audience might yawn. But sometimes those quiet scenes are where the story's heart actually lives. What forgotten really means, now don't get me wrong. Being forgotten doesn't mean being unimportant. It just means the story got buried under bigger noise. Think about it like this. If history were a crowded dinner table, you'd have Washington carving the turkey, Lincoln making emotional toasts, and Roosevelt yelling across the table about charging up San Juan Hill. Meanwhile, the quieter presidents, like Hayes Coolidge or Arthur, are politely passing the mashed potatoes, saying smart things no one hears over the noise. That's who we're talking about. The polite, decent, quietly effective ones who didn't shout their legacy. They just lived it. A little humor in the hallways. If ghosts really do haunt the White House, I bet it's not Washington pacing the halls. It's Millard Fillmore checking if anyone finally remembered what he did. Or Chester A. Arthur whispering, "Hey, I made civil service reforms, you know." And somewhere in the background, poor Buchanan sighing, "I just wanted everyone to get along." History forgot them, but maybe that's okay. Maybe they'd prefer it that way. Less pressure, fewer statues, more peace. After all, imagine being a famous president. Every move, every quote, every mistake remembered forever. Some of these guys probably enjoyed slipping out of the spotlight. What you'll discover in this story over the next few chapters, we'll wander through the lives of these quiet leaders. We'll see how they tried, failed, and sometimes succeeded in shaping the nation. You'll hear about presidents who modernized the postal system, balanced budgets, fought corruption, or stood up for justice when it wasn't popular. You'll learn about the forgotten innovators, the ones who brought electricity to the White House, who reformed the government, who protected jobs, who tried to bridge deep divisions. They might not have their faces on Mount Rushmore, but their fingerprints are still all over the country you live in. A gentle reflection. Before we move on, so tonight, as we drift through this history, remember this. The story of a nation isn't just made of legends. It's built by ordinary leaders, quiet decisions, and moments that never made the headlines. Sometimes the most important work happens when no one's looking, and sometimes the truest kind of greatness isn't remembered at all. That's the beauty of forgotten presidents. They remind us that history isn't just about fame, it's about effort, character, and quiet service. So, take a slow breath. Let the noise of the famous fade out for a moment, and picture a dusty hallway in the White House, lined with portraits you've probably never looked at twice. They're waiting there. Millard, Franklin, Rutherford, Chester, smiling softly, like they know a secret. And maybe, just maybe, by the end of this story, we'll finally listen. Let's step back now, way back. Back to the days when the country was still figuring out what kind of nation it wanted to be. The early presidents walked through a fog of uncertainty, where every decision felt like writing a rule book no one had written before. But here's the twist. Not all of them became famous for it. Some worked just as hard as Washington or Jefferson, yet history left them standing in the dark corners of the presidential lineup. These are the early leaders we barely talk about, but probably should. Millard Fillmore, the accidental president Millard Fillmore. Now there's a name that sounds like a 19th century butler, doesn't it? But he wasn't serving tea. He was serving as the 13th president of the United States. Fillmore's story began quietly, just like his personality. He wasn't born rich or powerful. In fact, he grew up in a log cabin in upstate New York, working hard just to get an education. He taught himself law, climbed his way up through politics, and one day, by a strange twist of fate, found himself sitting in the Oval Office. He didn't actually win an election to become president. He was vice president under Zachary Taylor, who died unexpectedly in 1850. And that's how Fillmore became president, not through a campaign, but through a tragedy. Now, what did he do that history forgot? Quite a bit, actually. Fillmore helped shape the Compromise of 1850, a set of laws meant to keep the North and South from tearing each other apart over slavery. It delayed the Civil War. Didn't stop it, but delayed it by about 10 years. In a way, his quiet compromise gave America a few more years to prepare for what was coming. He also sent the first American trade mission to Japan, opening a relationship that would grow into one of the most important in modern times. Not bad for someone who usually gets left out of the history books. But why did he fade from memory? Because the compromise he supported included the Fugitive Slave Act, a law that forced even free states to return escaped enslaved people. It was deeply unpopular and it destroyed his reputation in the North. So Fillmore's story became one of mixed legacy, part peacemaker, part villain. History didn't quite know where to place him, so it just didn't. Poor guy. Even his name sounds like someone history would forget. Millard Fillmore. If he'd been called Max Steel or Clint Freedom, we might still be talking about him. John Tyler, the president nobody voted for. Next up, John Tyler. You probably haven't heard much about him, and that's fair. He's kind of the forgotten middle child of early American presidents. Tyler was the first man to ever become president because another one died in office. That may sound normal today, but in 1841, it caused a small constitutional panic. People didn't even know if the vice president could legally take over. Some said he should just act as temporary president. But Tyler said, "Nope, I am the president now." And he was right. His firm decision quietly shaped the line of succession we still follow today. Every time a vice president steps up after tragedy, they're following Tyler's example. Tyler also worked to annex Texas into the United States, a massive move that changed the country's map forever. Yet he's rarely mentioned in classrooms. Why? Because politics turned on him. His own party kicked him out halfway through his term. Imagine getting fired from your own political team. That's a tough day at the office. When he left Washington, nobody threw him a parade. In fact, Congress refused to even fund his projects. It's as if America collectively said thanks but no thanks and moved on. Still, Tyler stood firm, doing what he thought was right. He might not have been beloved, but he was bold, and maybe a little stubborn. That's the thing about forgotten presidents. Most weren't lazy or useless. They just made hard choices at quiet moments in history. James Buchanan, the man who tried to stop the storm now. If there's one president history loves to blame, it's James Buchanan. Poor man gets roasted in nearly every worst president's list out there. But if we slow down and look closer, his story is less simple and a little sad. Buchanan became president in 1857, right when America was splitting apart over slavery. The South wanted to leave, the North wanted to stop them, and the whole country was like a pot about to boil over. Buchanan's problem? He tried to please everyone. He believed the Constitution didn't give him the power to stop secession. So he basically said, let's just wait and see. By the time he left office, 11 states had already decided to leave the Union. Ouch. He's remembered as weak, the man who did nothing as the Civil War began. But here's the thing. Buchanan wasn't lazy or heartless. He was terrified that if he acted too strongly, he'd make the split worse. So he chose caution over confrontation, and that choice destroyed his reputation. Still, there's something almost human about him. He wasn't a villain. He was a man trapped in an impossible situation, doing what he thought was right. In another time, he might have been remembered as a careful, thoughtful leader. Instead, he became history's favorite scapegoat. And get this, Buchanan never married. He's America's only lifelong bachelor president. Some say his niece acted as first lady for him, and she adored him. When people criticized her uncle, she said, "History will do him justice." It hasn't, at least not yet. Maybe that's what makes him interesting. Not his success, but his quiet failure. Because failure, too, is a kind of legacy. The forgotten foundations. These early presidents didn't shout, they didn't win massive wars, and they didn't become faces on money. But they built the foundations that held the nation together, even if just barely. Fillmore kept the peace for a few more years. Tyler defined what presidential succession even meant. Buchanan faced the impossible and tried to hold the center as it collapsed. They were the glue between eras, the men who filled the space between Washington's Revolution and Lincoln's War. And because their time wasn't flashy, they vanished from memory. It's kind of unfair, really. They were like the background crew in a movie, the ones who hold up the lights and move the props, while the stars get all the applause. But without them, the show doesn't run. The strange comfort of being forgotten. Sometimes, I think there's a strange peace in being forgotten. Fillmore, Tyler, Buchanan. Their portraits hang quietly in museum halls. No one's arguing about them on Twitter. No documentaries shouting the truth they don't want you to know. They've become quiet ghosts of leadership. Reminders that not every story ends with fame and not every failure means failure forever. Maybe history forgets them not because they mattered less, but because they mattered differently. They were steady hands in stormy times, and when the storm finally broke, their names slipped beneath the waves. So tonight, maybe give them a little thought before sleep. Imagine Fillmore's calm voice signing papers by candlelight. Tyler stubbornly standing by his decision while everyone else argued. Buchanan staring at a map of a country falling apart, wishing he could stop it. They tried, and sometimes trying is its own kind of courage. In the next chapter, we'll meet the quiet innovators, the men who brought reform, modernization, and progress to a young America, yet still drifted out of our collective memory. For now, take a slow breath. The forgotten presidents are whispering their stories again. Not loudly, but softly, just enough for those who care to listen. Some presidents lead armies. Some shout from balconies. And then there are the quiet ones, the doers, not the talkers. They come into office without drama, make a few quiet changes that shape the future, and then, poof. History politely forgets them, but innovation doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Tonight we'll drift through the stories of two such presidents, men who never asked to be remembered, but who still left fingerprints all over modern America. Rutherford B. Hayes, the honest reformer Rutherford. Burchard Hayes. Now that's a name that sounds like it should belong to a very serious banker or maybe a gentleman detective in a British novel. But Hayes was neither. He was America's 19th president, and one of the cleanest, calmest, most integrity-driven men to ever walk through the White House doors. His presidency started, well, awkwardly. The election of 1876 was a complete mess. The votes were so close that no one knew who actually won, Hayes or his opponent Samuel Tilden. It came down to contested ballots, secret meetings, and backroom deals. At one point, the country genuinely feared another civil war. Finally, Congress made a deal. Hayes would become president, but only if he agreed to end military occupation in the South. He accepted, and peace held, barely. Most people stopped paying attention right there. Boring president, they said. No wars, no scandals, no drama. But that's the thing. Hayes's calm steadiness was the story. He cleaned up corruption in the government. He started reforms that made sure jobs were earned by skill, not political favor. In other words, if you wanted a government job under Hayes, you couldn't just say, "My cousin knows a senator." You actually had to be qualified. He also pushed for education, for everyone, regardless of race, at a time when that idea wasn't popular in many states. Hayes believed that real freedom meant knowledge, and he said, "Education is the only sure foundation for freedom." Simple words, but powerful ones. And yet, history yawns, because his time was peaceful, his leadership steady. He didn't give fiery speeches or win massive wars. He just quietly made the government cleaner, fairer, and smarter. If Hayes were alive today, he'd probably be the guy in the group project who does all the work, organizes everything neatly, and then watches someone else get the credit. You know the type. Chester A. Arthur, the surprise reformer. Now, if Rutherford Hayes was calm and upright from the start, Chester A. Arthur was, well, the opposite. When Arthur became president in 1881, people didn't expect much from him. In fact, most Americans assumed he'd be terrible. Before the presidency, Arthur was known as a machine politician, meaning he was part of the good old boys network that handed out government jobs to friends and supporters. He wore fancy suits, threw big parties, and loved the high life. A true New York gentleman with perfect mutton chop sideburns, but then, something unexpected happened. Arthur's boss, President James Garfield, was shot by an angry office seeker who screamed, "Now Arthur will be president." It was horrifying. And when Garfield died, Arthur took office under a cloud of suspicion and guilt. People thought he'd secretly benefited from the assassination, but what Arthur did next shocked everyone. He changed. Completely. Instead of continuing the corrupt system that got him into power, Arthur spent his presidency tearing it down. He championed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, which made it illegal to hand out government jobs based on political connections. For the first time, public servants had to pass exams to prove they were qualified. In other words, Arthur helped invent the modern idea of merit-based government. No more friends-only clubs. No more, "You scratch my back, I'll give you a job" politics. And here's the part that's quietly beautiful. Arthur did it knowing it would cost him his career. His old political allies were furious. When re-election time came around, his party dropped him. He didn't even try to fight it. When someone asked why he wasn't campaigning, Arthur simply said, "I can't think of any reason why I should be re-elected." How's that for honesty? He finished his term with quiet dignity, walked out of the White House, and went back to New York. He died a year later, almost forgotten, but the reforms he started became the foundation of modern American bureaucracy. There's a painting of Chester A. Arthur where he's sitting calmly at his desk, pen in hand, surrounded by rich mahogany furniture. He looks relaxed but focused. You can almost hear him thinking, well, if I'm going to be president, I might as well do it properly. Innovation. Without headlines. It's funny how history treats innovation. When a president builds a railroad, declares a war, or opens a new frontier, it becomes legend. But when they make government fairer or more honest, well, that's not exactly thrilling TV material. No fireworks. No speeches that echo through the ages. Just quiet progress. The kind that only shows its value years later. Hayes and Arthur never saw their reforms fully bloom. But thanks to them, thousands of future public servants earned jobs based on skill, not favors. Their quiet insistence on fairness slowly transformed how America worked. And maybe that's the kind of innovation that matters most. The one you can't see right away, but that shapes everything quietly beneath the surface, like the roots of a tree, why they were forgotten. So why aren't Hayes and Arthur remembered? Well, because they were too normal. No wars, no major scandals, no dramatic endings. Just good governance, and let's be honest, that doesn't grab headlines. You never see a movie called The President Who Balanced the Budget and Went to Bed on Time. History, like entertainment, loves chaos. But these men gave the country something it desperately needed: calm. It's almost poetic, really. While the loud presidents wrote history with thunder, the quiet ones repaired the roof when it leaked. You may not notice them, but without them, the house would have fallen apart. A moment of reflection, picture it for a second. The year is 1882. Gas lamps flicker in the White House halls. Arthur leans over his desk, signing a bill that will change how government works forever. Outside, the night is silent. No crowds cheer. No fireworks burst. Just one man doing the right thing quietly. That's innovation too. The slow, steady kind that outlives applause. And in another time, Hayes sits by the fire, writing in his diary. He kept one for years. He writes about honesty, duty, and the future of education. He doesn't know his words will be forgotten. He just knows they're true. The gentle legacy. When we talk about innovation today, we think of technology, shiny new things, fast and loud progress. But in the 19th century, innovation often meant reform, fixing broken systems, laying foundations that others could build upon. Hayes and Arthur were quiet craftsmen of democracy, men who repaired the machine of government so it could run smoother for everyone who came after. They might not have monuments, but their work still echoes in every fair hiring process, every honest examination, every act of public service that's earned, not given. And maybe, when you think about it, that's the truest kind of innovation there is. The not-so-perfect presidency. Let's get one thing straight. Every president, yes, every single one, made mistakes. Some got away with them. Some didn't. And some, well, history just sighed and said, let's pretend that didn't happen. We tend to think of presidents as perfect marble statues, calm, wise, and noble. But behind the portraits, these were just people. People who lost their tempers, trusted the wrong friends, or made choices they probably regretted while staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. So let's rewind the clock to a few of those oops moments that never made it to the front page of your history class. Ulysses S. Grant and the Whiskey Ring. When trust went sour, Ulysses S. Grant, war hero, Civil War legend, all-around American tough guy. The man could command armies, but apparently couldn't command his friends. During Grant's presidency, a big scandal bubbled up. The Whiskey Ring. Sounds like a fun party, right? Nope. It was a massive tax evasion scheme where government officials and whiskey distillers teamed up to cheat the treasury out of millions. Now here's where it gets awkward. Grant wasn't personally involved, but some of his closest allies were. And when the scandal broke, instead of stepping back, Grant defended his friends. Loyalty can be a beautiful thing, until your friends are stealing federal tax money. Eventually, hundreds were arrested and the country was shocked. But Grant, he doubled down and even said his famous line, "Let no guilty man escape if it can be avoided." Which, by the way, is the presidential version of "I messed up." But let's keep it professional. In the end, his reputation took a hit. But historians now admit he wasn't the crook. Just a man who trusted too much. And honestly, haven't we all had that one friend who says, "Trust me, I've got this," before everything goes completely off the rails? Andrew Johnson, the almost fired president. Then there's Andrew Johnson, the guy who became president after Lincoln was assassinated. Tough shoes to fill, right? Imagine walking into work the day after your boss, one of the most loved figures in history, is gone, and everyone's watching to see how you'll mess up. Johnson's presidency was rocky from the start. He didn't get along with Congress at all. They passed laws. He vetoed them. They tried to rebuild the South after the Civil War. He said, no thanks. It got so bad that Congress decided, you know what? Let's just fire him. And boom, Johnson became the first U.S. president to be impeached. Now, impeachment sounds dramatic, but here's the twist. He wasn't actually removed from office. The Senate missed by one vote. One. Can you imagine sitting in your chair sweating bullets waiting for that last vote to be counted? When the dust settled, Johnson stayed president, but just barely. History mostly paints him as stubborn and unpopular. But the human side? He was grieving Lincoln, hated by his own party, and probably overwhelmed. A man trying to steer a broken country without a map or much support. And yet, centuries later, people barely remember how close America came to removing its leader for the first time. Grant's other problem: loyalty over logic. We have to go back to Grant for a second because the whiskey ring wasn't the only mess in his closet. His presidency was like a magnet for shady characters. There was also the Credit Mobilier scandal, a railroad fraud scheme that pulled in half of Washington's elite. The country was expanding fast and everyone wanted a piece of the railroad boom. So some politicians decided, hey, what if we just create a fake company and pay ourselves with government money? Brilliant. Until, of course, people found out. Again, Grant wasn't directly guilty, but the pattern was clear. Great general, loyal friend, terrible judge of character. He was like that nice uncle who keeps lending money to family members who just need a little help getting back on their feet. The quiet scandals nobody talks about. Not all scandals were loud or explosive. Some were small, quiet, and strangely human. Take James Garfield, for instance. He wasn't involved in scandal himself, but his assassination came because of one. A man named Charles Guiteau shot him because he didn't get the government job he thought he deserved. Why? Because the system was full of corruption and favoritism. You could literally buy your way into a federal job. Garfield's death forced America to fix that system. Out of tragedy came reform. But again, most people never learn that detail. They just hear Garfield got shot. Not Garfield's death cleaned up Washington. Then there was Rutherford B. Hayes, who became president after one of the sketchiest elections ever. The 1876 election was so close, people called it the Great Compromise. Basically, Hayes got the White House in exchange for ending Reconstruction in the South. In short, he won, but democracy kind of lost. He knew it too. Hayes called himself a president without a country. These moments don't make flashy documentaries, but they shape the nation in quiet, messy ways. When media played favorites now, here's where things get spicy. Back in the 1800s, the media wasn't neutral. Most newspapers were openly tied to political parties. So if you were a president, your reputation depended on who owned the press. Grant? Some papers called him a saint. Others said he was a fool surrounded by crooks. Andrew Johnson? One paper painted him as a tyrant. Another said he was the people's defender. There was no CNN fact check, just loud opinions, ink, and bias. So when scandals happened, the media could either blow them up or bury them. If you had the right friends, your mistakes disappeared into yesterday's paper. If not, you were toast. Sound familiar? Presidents. Humans, after all, it's easy to laugh at these old scandals now. Whiskey rings, railroads, one-vote impeachments. It sounds like a weird political sitcom. But these were real people under massive pressure, running a growing country filled with chaos and change. They made mistakes because they were human, because they trusted the wrong people, got stubborn, or couldn't keep up with the speed of history. And yet, many of them didn't fall apart. They kept going. Grant spent his final years writing a book about his life while dying of cancer, determined to leave something honest behind. Johnson returned to the Senate years later, still fighting. They stumbled, yes, but they didn't vanish quietly. That's the part history usually forgets. The comeback, the forgotten lesson. Here's the thing, scandals don't always define people. Sometimes how they survived the scandal says more than the scandal itself. Grant could have hidden. Johnson could have quit. Hayes could have denied the deal that got him elected. But they all faced it, awkwardly, imperfectly, humanly. Maybe that's the lesson buried in the shadows. Even the people we put on pedestals trip over their own feet. Even the powerful get humbled. And maybe that's why when we whisper about forgotten presidents, we're really whispering about the parts of ourselves that mess up and keep going anyway. Closing reflection, so next time you see a dusty portrait in a museum, take a second look. That serious-looking man in the old suit? He probably lived through more drama, mistakes, and lessons than any history book will admit. And in those quiet missteps, the scandals history downplayed, you'll find the most human kind of leadership. Not perfect. Not glamorous. Just real. America didn't always look like it does now. At one point, the country was small. Just 13 colonies hugging the Atlantic like a cautious swimmer afraid to go too deep. But expansion was the dream. The idea that America was meant to spread westward, manifest destiny as they called it, and behind that dream weren't just explorers or settlers. There were presidents, some famous, some nearly forgotten, signing papers, making deals, and sometimes gambling with history. They didn't ride horses into battle. They negotiated in candlelit rooms. They didn't wave flags. They stared at maps, and yet the lines they drew changed everything. James K. Polk, the expansion president nobody talks about. Let's start with James K. Polk, the guy most Americans forget existed. And honestly, that's a shame because Polk did more to expand the U.S. map than almost anyone. When he became president in 1845, the United States looked incomplete. The West Coast wasn't ours yet. Texas was still an argument waiting to happen. And Britain was eyeing the Oregon Territory like it was a Black Friday deal. But Polk had a plan. In just 4 years, one single term, he expanded the country from the Atlantic to the Pacific. That's right, the whole coast-to-coast thing, that was Polk's doing. He annexed Texas, settled the Oregon boundary with Britain, and started a war with Mexico that led to the U.S. gaining California, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and more. In short, the man bought America a West Coast. Now let's pause. That's the kind of resume that should make him a household name, right? But somehow he ended up as one of history's most underrated presidents. Why? Because he was boring, no wild speeches, no scandals, no fancy hair like Jackson. Just a serious man with a to-do list, and he finished it. He literally ran on 4 goals. Lower tariffs, create a treasury system, settle Oregon, expand into California and the Southwest. 4 years later, he checked them all off and walked away. Mic drop, the cost of expansion. Of course, expansion came at a price. The war with Mexico wasn't exactly peaceful. Thousands died, and every new territory brought one big question. Would it allow slavery or not? That debate tore the nation apart in the decades that followed. So Polk's legacy is complicated. He made America bigger, but also set the stage for the Civil War. It's like he built a beautiful house, but accidentally left the stove on. Still, when you look at a modern U.S. map, you're basically looking at Polk's handiwork. Quiet, efficient, maybe a bit too ambitious, but undeniably historic. John Tyler, the accidental annexer now. Let's rewind a little to John Tyler. You might remember him from Chapter 1 where we called him Who. That's still accurate. Tyler wasn't even supposed to be president. He was vice president under William Henry Harrison, who famously gave the longest inauguration speech in freezing rain and died a month later. Seriously, talk about bad luck. So Tyler steps in, America's first accidental president. No one wanted him there. Even his own party kicked him out. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite all that, Tyler made one of the biggest moves in U.S. history, the annexation of Texas. The Texas had broken away from Mexico and wanted to join the U.S., but it was a political nightmare. The North didn't want another slave state. The South was all for it, and Mexico warned that if America took Texas, there'd be war. Most presidents hesitated, but Tyler, he said, "Hey, let's do it anyway." In 1845, right before leaving office, he pushed through the annexation. Texas officially became part of the United States, and history barely gave him a thank you card. Ironically, Polk got all the credit later when the Mexican-American War began. Tyler's move was the spark. Polk's was the explosion. But here's the funny thing, John Tyler didn't care about fame. He actually said, "Popularity, I have always found, is a dangerous possession." Well, mission accomplished. He got none. Still, that one signature changed everything. Without Tyler, there's no Texas, no Houston, no cowboy movies, no country music. Okay, maybe that's a stretch, but you get the point. The long-term ripple effects Polk and Tyler's decisions shaped America's borders for good. But they also shaped politics, identity, and even culture. Think about it. California's rise as a global tech and entertainment hub. That started with Polk's War. The Southern power struggle that led to secession? That began with the addition of Texas. Even the dream of heading west, the idea of freedom and open land, that was their doing. Every time someone drives Route 66, takes a photo at the Grand Canyon, or moves to Los Angeles chasing a dream, they're walking through the echoes of decisions made 180 years ago. The forgotten geography lessons. What's wild is how invisible these names have become. We remember Lincoln, Roosevelt, and Kennedy, but the presidents who literally drew the map of America, they're just trivia answers. Ask someone who annexed Texas, they'll shrug. Who brought in California? Silence. But everyone remembers the guy who chopped down a cherry tree that never existed. It's funny how our brains choose legends over logistics. Because while some presidents gave speeches about freedom, others quietly made that freedom possible by expanding the borders where people could live, dream, and build. The gamble of greatness, expansion, wasn't just about land. It was about ego, pride, and risk. Polk gambled that America could handle being twice its size. Tyler gambled that annexing Texas wouldn't blow up the Union. Both men bet everything on their vision, and in different ways. They were right and wrong at the same time. Tyler's move toward Texas triggered tension that split the nation. But without it, America might have stayed a regional power, not a continental one. Polk's war brought incredible land gains, but it also deepened the moral and political wounds that would explode into the Civil War. It's a reminder that even good decisions can come with shadows. Progress often walks side by side with trouble. The human side of expansion, imagine the stress these men felt. No internet, no phones, just letters that took weeks and decisions that could start wars. Tyler faced public hatred. Polk worked himself to death, literally. After finishing his one-term checklist, he left office exhausted and died just 3 months later. Some say it was cholera, others say it was overwork. Either way, he achieved everything he promised, and didn't live to enjoy it. If that's not the most tragic mission accomplished in history, I don't know what is. The lines that built a nation, it's strange to think that a few signatures created the America we know. Polk's signature brought in California's gold. Arizona's deserts, Oregon's forests. Tyler's signature brought in Texas's oil fields and wide-open plains. They didn't build monuments or lead great battles. They drew lines that outlived them. The borders we take for granted today were once dreams scribbled on a map. And the men behind them? Forgotten architects of destiny. Closing reflections next time you look at a U.S. map. Take a moment to think of the quiet presidents. The ones who didn't shout, didn't campaign for glory but changed everything anyway. Polk, the overachiever who built an empire in 4 years. Tyler, the accidental president who gave America Texas. Their names might not echo like Lincoln or Washington, but their lines still shape every journey, every road trip, every horizon we see, because in the end, power isn't always about noise. Sometimes it's just a man, a pen, and a map waiting to become a nation. Cleveland was like that one strict teacher everyone hated in school, until years later when you realized, okay, maybe he had a point. He wasn't flashy, didn't enjoy big speeches, and didn't really like crowds. But when chaos hit, he was one of the few presidents who could just take a deep breath and say, all right, everyone calm down. In the 1890s, America was bursting with labor unrest. Workers were striking everywhere, railroads, factories, you name it. Then came the Pullman strike of 1894. Picture this. Railroads shut down, mail stopped moving, and the economy started to creak like an old barn door. Most presidents might have panicked. Cleveland? Nope. He quietly sent in federal troops to restore order, not because he hated workers, but because he believed the mail had to move. It was his version of saying, look, I don't care who started it, just don't mess with the mailman. Was it controversial? Absolutely. People hated him for it. Newspapers roasted him like a Thanksgiving turkey, but his calm, law-first approach kept the entire nation from spiraling. Funny thing is, Cleveland didn't see himself as a hero. He once said, a man is not saved by the Constitution if he's unwilling to save the Constitution himself. Not exactly a slogan for TikTok, but it tells you who he was. A man who thought peace came from discipline, not drama. William Howard Taft, the diplomat with a sweet tooth next up. William Howard Taft. Most folks remember him as the big guy who got stuck in a bathtub. Spoiler, that story's probably not true. What's true, though, is that Taft might have been one of the best peace presidents America ever had. He just didn't brag about it. Unlike Teddy Roosevelt before him, who loved to speak softly and carry a big stick, Taft was more like speak kindly and bring a box of chocolates. During his presidency, 1909-1913, he pushed for something called dollar diplomacy. The idea was simple. Instead of sending soldiers to solve problems abroad, the U.S. would invest money, build infrastructure, and influence countries through business rather than bullets. In plain words, why fight when we can trade? He encouraged American companies to invest in Latin America and Asia, hoping economic ties would keep peace strong. Some called it smart, others called it sneaky. But either way, Taft's diplomacy changed how the U.S. handled global influence. He once said, "The diplomacy of the present administration is one of peace." He really meant it. But here's the thing. Taft hated being president. He actually wanted to be a judge. After leaving office, he got his wish and became Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, the only person in history to hold both jobs. You could say his legacy was less about war and more about balance, the kind of peace that comes from patience, not power. A peaceful presidency in a noisy era. Both Cleveland and Taft served during loud, chaotic times, economic crashes, angry mobs, political fights that made Congress look like a bad reality show. But what made them stand out wasn't how loud they shouted. It's how quietly they acted. They were the kind of leaders who believed peace isn't a headline, it's a habit. Cleveland's stubbornness saved the country from political meltdown more than once. Taft's calmness helped America grow its influence without adding another war to the list. Neither man was popular when they left office, but history has a funny way of rewarding quiet people later. While their flashier peers are remembered for wars and speeches, Cleveland and Taft are remembered, if at all, for the peace they quietly protected. The forgotten crisis managers. There's another interesting side to this. How these presidents handled crises that didn't make it into the history books. Cleveland, for example, faced a full-blown economic collapse in 1893. Banks failed, jobs vanished, and people lined up for soup. He could have gone full populist and blamed the rich, but instead, he tried to fix the financial system calmly and legally, even though it made him look cold-hearted. And Taft? He quietly dealt with revolutions in Central America by promoting democracy without waving a sword. He sent negotiators instead of ships. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, most of the time. Their kind of leadership doesn't make good action movies, but it's the reason the country didn't fall apart when it easily could have, why they were forgotten. So why don't we remember guys like this? Because peace doesn't sell. History books, let's be honest, YouTube thumbnails and love drama. War, betrayal, scandal, those things get clicks. But a president who simply kept things steady? Not so much. Cleveland didn't conquer anything. Taft didn't rally the nation to battle. They just quietly made sure the system didn't break. And somehow that's exactly why they faded from memory. But if you look closely, every peaceful moment in American history sits on the foundation they built. The quiet power of calm leadership. There's something kind of beautiful about that, right? Cleveland and Taft didn't chase fame, they chased order. They didn't raise armies, and they raised standards. They remind us that leadership isn't always about shouting louder than the next guy. Sometimes it's about keeping your head when everyone else is losing theirs. Maybe that's why we should remember them. Not as forgotten presidents, but as proof that calm doesn't mean weak and peace doesn't mean boring. Benjamin Harrison, the forgotten fighter for rights. Benjamin Harrison isn't a name you'll hear often unless you're a hardcore history fan. He's usually remembered as the president who sat between two Grover Clevelands. Yes, Cleveland served before and after Harrison. It's weird, I know. But Harrison was more than a middle chapter in someone else's story. He actually cared deeply about something most politicians at the time didn't want to touch: civil rights for African Americans. Now, this was the 1890s, not exactly a golden era for equality. The Civil War was over, sure, but racism wasn't. Reconstruction had crumbled, segregation laws were tightening, and violence against black citizens was spreading across the South. While most politicians pretended not to see it, Harrison spoke up. He pushed for a federal elections bill, which aimed to protect black voters from intimidation and violence. Basically, it said, hey, if local governments won't let citizens vote fairly, the federal government will step in. That might sound normal today, but back then, it was like dropping a truth bomb in Congress. Southern politicians lost their minds. Even northern ones got nervous. The bill didn't pass. It was blocked by the Senate. But Harrison's effort planted a seed. He was one of the first presidents to say, equality isn't just a slogan, it's federal business. He also appointed African Americans to government positions, invited black leaders to the White House, and openly condemned lynching when most leaders wouldn't even whisper about it. No, he didn't win the war on racism, but he fought when most didn't bother. And sometimes that's what makes a legacy, doing the right thing when it's unpopular. If Harrison lived today, he probably wouldn't be trending on Twitter, but his quiet courage would have earned him respect in every corner of the internet. Calvin Coolidge, the president who let silence speak now. If Benjamin Harrison was the man who spoke when it was risky, Calvin Coolidge was the man who stayed quiet when everyone else was loud. They called him Silent Cal, and he earned it. Reporters would ask him questions and he'd just stare. Sometimes he'd give a one-line answer so short it felt like a mystery. Once, a dinner guest told him, "Mr. President, I bet I can make you say more than 2 words." Coolidge replied, "You lose." Classic. But behind that dry humor and short sentences, Coolidge shaped something much bigger, a cultural attitude. He came to power in the 1920s, right after World War I, when America was buzzing with jazz, cars, and the first radio shows. The country was rich and restless, growing faster than anyone could keep track. And Coolidge's philosophy? Simple. The business of America is business. Now, that line gets mocked sometimes, but here's the thing. It captured the mood of an entire generation. He believed the best way to keep peace was to let people work, build, and dream without too much government in their way. So he kept taxes low, balanced the budget, and avoided loud reforms. His calm leadership made Americans feel like the grown-ups were finally back in charge after years of war and drama. He didn't try to control the culture, but his quiet confidence became part of it. The 1920s Coolidge vibe was about restraint, responsibility, and respect for hard work. It wasn't flashy, but it stuck. Even after the stock market crashed in 1929, which wasn't his fault, he'd already left office. People looked back at his years as the calm before the storm. Culture, the slow builder see. Here's the thing about cultural influence. It doesn't happen overnight. When Harrison fought for civil rights, it didn't make the front page for long. When Coolidge balanced the budget, people just shrugged. But decades later, those choices quietly shaped how Americans thought about fairness, work, and government's role in everyday life. Harrison's moral courage inspired future presidents who did get to pass civil rights laws. Coolidge's steady hand helped shape the idea that presidents shouldn't always be loud crusaders, that sometimes just not messing things up is its own kind of leadership. These guys didn't tweet, campaign endlessly, or make grand promises. They just showed up, did their jobs, and left footprints so faint you only notice them when you look back far enough. Small actions, big ripples. Let's look at it another way. Think of America like a river. Some presidents are like thunderstorms, huge, loud, and impossible to miss. They shake everything up. Harrison and Coolidge, they were the slow, steady current that kept the river flowing straight. Harrison's stand for equality kept the ideal of justice alive when it could have died out completely. Coolidge's calm leadership helped people believe in stability during a wild, changing time. Neither man got parades when they left office. Harrison lost his re-election. Coolidge didn't even run again. He just said, "I do not choose to run," and went home to take naps and feed his cats. Yes, he had cats. Lots of them. But both left legacies that still show up today, in classrooms, in political debates, and even in how Americans expect presidents to behave. Why we forget the builders. So why don't we talk about them more? Because they weren't flashy. They didn't break the system, they just held it together. And history, unfortunately, is a bit like social media. It rewards drama. Presidents who caused chaos get remembered. Presidents who kept things calm fade away. But calm doesn't mean unimportant. It just means they were building something solid while the rest of the world was making noise. The quiet power of values. There's a theme running through both Harrison and Coolidge. It's values. For Harrison, it was moral courage. For Coolidge, it was personal discipline. They weren't perfect, no president is. But they reminded Americans that leadership isn't always about laws and wars. Sometimes it's about tone. It's about showing what kind of behavior deserves respect. What kind of thinking builds a country that lasts? Their values, honesty, fairness, humility, still echo in the better moments of American politics. James Garfield. The dream of education and unity, James Garfield. Poor guy. He barely got to be president before tragedy struck. He served only a few months before he was assassinated in 1881. But in that short time, he delivered one of the most quietly hopeful speeches in American history. His inaugural address wasn't about power or politics. It was about education. He said, "Next in importance to freedom and justice is popular education, without which neither freedom nor justice can be permanently maintained." Now that's something you'd expect to hear from a modern-day TED Talk, not a 19th century president with a mustache and a stovepipe hat. Garfield believed education was the heart of democracy. He argued that an ignorant people could never stay free, and he wasn't wrong. He saw education not as a privilege but as a weapon against inequality. But here's the sad part. His words never had time to grow roots. He was shot just 4 months into office. His speech got buried under headlines about his death and the chaos that followed. Still, those words hang in the air even now, gentle, idealistic, and somehow ahead of their time. You could almost imagine him today, scrolling through social media, sighing and saying, "See, this is exactly what I was talking about." Rutherford B. Hayes, a warning about power next up. Rutherford B. Hayes, the man with the beard so impressive it could have run for office on its own. Hayes isn't exactly a household name. But near the end of his presidency, he gave a speech that might be one of the most quietly prophetic things ever said by an American leader. In 1880, he wrote in his diary, because that's what thoughtful presidents did before Twitter, something that reads like a warning to the future. "This is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. No longer if the moneyed interests can control the vote." Let that sink in. Hayes saw it coming. Corporate power, money and politics, the tug-of-war between democracy and greed. He didn't scream about it. He just quietly pointed out the danger, like a teacher reminding the class that the test isn't over yet. Nobody quoted it much back then. The Gilded Age was all about wealth, railroads, and fancy suits. People didn't want to hear about corruption. They wanted to party. But Hayes's quiet fear turned out to be one of the truest things ever written about America. If he lived now, he'd probably be that calm uncle at Thanksgiving who says one wise thing, and then everyone just sits in awkward silence because they know he's right. John Quincy Adams, the voice of conscience. John Quincy Adams, son of a founding father, former president, and later a congressman, wasn't exactly a warm, fuzzy guy. He could make an ice cube look friendly, but when it came to moral courage, the man was a lighthouse. After his presidency, he gave speeches in Congress that should have made him a legend, especially his 1837 speech against slavery. He stood up and said, in essence, "If this nation is to survive, it cannot live half slave and half free." Sound familiar? Yep, Lincoln would echo that idea decades later. But Adams said it first, long before it was safe to say such things. His words were calm but fierce, full of conviction without drama. He spoke like a man who knew history would one day catch up, even if no one clapped for him at the time. People called him old and stubborn. He called himself a servant of truth. And in the end, truth remembered him better than fame ever could. Calvin Coolidge, the quiet philosopher now. Let's talk about Silent Cal again. Calvin Coolidge. Yeah, the quiet guy from Chapter 7. But behind that silence, the man had some surprisingly deep thoughts. In 1925, He gave a speech titled "The Inspiration of the Declaration of Independence." Sounds boring, right? But hang on. This one's a hidden gem. Coolidge said, "If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions." He was basically saying we already figured out the basics. Stop pretending we need to reinvent fairness. It's not a dramatic message, but it's solid, grounded, and timeless. Coolidge wasn't about shaking things up. He was about reminding people that sometimes stability is the real revolution. His speech didn't trend, obviously. No radio clips went viral. But you can feel his words living quietly in the background of every modern argument about freedom and rights. That's the thing about Coolidge. He didn't need applause. His words were meant to outlive the noise. Why these words faded away? So why did these beautiful, thoughtful speeches fade? Well, partly because history is a tough crowd. Wars, scandals, and big headlines drown out subtlety. A president can say something profound, but if someone else starts a war a month later, guess which story people remember? Also timing. Garfield's dream of education came too early. Hayes's warning about money and politics came too soon. Coolidge's faith in old values came right before the world demanded change. They weren't wrong. They were just early. And sometimes, being early is the same as being forgotten. The sleepy power of old words. But here's the fun part. When you dig up these speeches and read them now, they sound peaceful, thoughtful, like a gentle conversation by lamplight. No shouting, no applause, just simple honesty. You can almost imagine the candlelight flickering in a 19th century White House, ink drying on the page, and a tired president thinking, maybe someday, someone will understand. Well, here we are. Their words didn't vanish. They just took a long nap. And maybe that's the real charm of forgotten speeches. They come back when we need them most. The echo that never died, Garfield's belief in education. Hayes' warning about greed. Adams's defense of freedom. Coolidge's faith in timeless truths. Each of them spoke with quiet conviction, not because they wanted fame, but because they believed words could build something stronger than applause. Their speeches might not make it into viral history videos, but they whisper in the background of American life. Every debate about schools, justice, money, or equality carries a faint echo of their old sentences. James Garfield, the scholar in the White House. James Garfield is mostly remembered for his tragic assassination. But before that, he was a man of ideas and books, a real brainiac who loved to learn. He was one of the most well-educated presidents, a walking library of philosophy, languages, and classical history. In fact, Garfield taught Greek and Latin at a college before becoming president. Imagine a college professor climbing the ranks of politics, carrying dusty books in one hand and legislation in the other. He'd often quote Homer in speeches, sometimes confusing the average congressman. One funny anecdote. Garfield loved memorizing poetry. He could recite lines from Shakespeare or the Greek epics without even thinking. Guests at the White House sometimes complained he went on for hours about lines they barely understood. And yet his deep love for knowledge shaped the way he approached problems, methodically, thoughtfully, and often more carefully than his advisors expected. His personal curiosity wasn't just academic. He loved learning new skills and even experimented with inventions. Sadly, he didn't have long to share these passions. He was shot just months into office. But for a moment, the White House had a quiet scholar trying to blend intellect with leadership, showing that brains and politics could mix, if only briefly. Warren G. Harding, the literary president. Harding gets a bad rap in history books, mostly because of scandals that followed his death. But behind the headlines was a man who loved books, poetry, and even writing himself. He was a quiet thinker who liked to spend hours reading in the White House gardens, away from reporters and the crowd. He often wrote poetry, capturing thoughts about life, love, and society. Some poems were clumsy, others surprisingly reflective. One line reads like it was meant for bedtime. The days pass slowly like leaves in the wind, and yet the heart remembers them all. Harding also had a softer, humorous side. He liked to play practical jokes on close friends, sometimes leaving fake notes or absurd letters for his staff to find. It's strange to imagine a president hiding a whoopee cushion under a chair, but that was Harding's way of reminding himself and everyone else that life didn't always have to be serious. He struggled with health issues and personal stress too. Leading a country is hard enough, but Harding also carried private grief over lost loved ones. His quiet moments of reflection, combined with his love for literature, made him someone more human than history usually portrays. Grover Cleveland. Family Matters and Quiet Discipline. Grover Cleveland, the man of stern reputation, had a surprisingly warm personal life, though it was often private. He married Frances Folsom, who was 27 years younger than him. Their relationship was a mix of old-fashioned propriety and tender humor. The public rarely saw the playful side of Cleveland, but letters show he was deeply devoted to his family. Cleveland had 5 children, and he enjoyed simple domestic life whenever he could squeeze it in. He liked gardening, walking, and observing nature, ways to balance the stress of office with ordinary, calming activities. There's a small, almost bedtime story moment here. Cleveland loved walking alone at night around the White House grounds, sometimes pausing to look at the stars. He believed that small, quiet rituals helped him make better decisions. It's easy to picture him in slippers sipping tea, while the nation slept and the papers worried about politics. Calvin Coolidge. Silent Nights and Family Humor. Silent Cal, of course, gets mentioned for his quiet demeanor, but behind that reserved face was a family man with a subtle sense of humor. Coolidge adored his children and had playful traditions at home, like impromptu costume parties or reading bedtime stories in unusual voices. He believed children should be encouraged to explore, learn, and express themselves, but quietly. His eldest son, John, once said Coolidge had a serious sense of fun, showing that behind the stoic public mask, there was laughter, games, and fatherly warmth. Coolidge also had pets, lots of them. Cats, dogs, even birds. He once joked that a well-behaved dog could teach as much about responsibility as any textbook. These small, domestic details paint a softer image. A president whose leadership extended not only to policy, but also to simple moments of care and attention. Personal struggles and tragedy. It wasn't all laughter and books. Forgotten presidents also carried heavy burdens. Garfield faced the tension of being shot early in his presidency, leaving his family and the nation in shock. Harding's scandals overshadowed his personal grief. Harrison's daughter faced health struggles, and Cleveland had to juggle public duty with personal tragedies quietly. Even small personal quirks like Coolidge's extreme frugality or Harding's constant reading were ways to cope with the pressures of office. They remind us that behind every leader was a human being trying to stay balanced, trying to find calm in chaos. These stories show us that even those who didn't make headlines had lives full of joy, sorrow, learning, and love. They were people with families, pets, hobbies, and bedtime rituals, and in that way they feel closer to us than the statues and textbooks ever will. The quiet impact of private lives. Why does this matter? Because understanding their personal lives gives depth to history. Policies and speeches come alive when you see the humans behind them. Cleveland's thoughtful walks explain his calm leadership. Garfield's love for learning explains his careful approach to decisions. Harding's literary habits show that even a controversial president can have moments of reflection and beauty. Even small details, like bedtime routines, hobbies, or family anecdotes, influence how presidents think and act. They show that leadership isn't just about what's visible. It's also about what happens in quiet, unseen corners of life. A bedtime reflection: imagine the White House at night. Candles flicker, papers lie scattered. A president leans over his desk reading a poem or scribbling a note to a loved one. Outside, the city sleeps. Inside, small moments like these shape the nation quietly. These forgotten presidents remind us that history isn't just a collection of battles, speeches, and laws. It's about human beings trying, stumbling, and finding small ways to leave a mark. Sometimes the biggest impacts come not from fame or power, but from personal choices, simple habits, and quiet dedication. And as you drift to sleep tonight, picture them not as distant figures, but as people who loved, laughed, worried, and worked just like us. They were humans first, presidents second, and in that human side they become more relatable, more comforting, and somehow more real. Quiet decisions, lasting ripples. Take James K. Polk, for instance. Most people know him as the president who expanded the country, but not everyone thinks about how those territorial decisions shaped modern life. The borders we take for granted, the states we drive through, and even some political debates today are echoes of his choices. People might argue about politics, but Polk quietly set the stage for the nation's geographic foundation. Similarly, John Tyler's annexation of Texas might not make history textbooks exciting reading, but it directly affected the shape of the U.S., its economy, and even future conflicts. These were calculated moves that didn't involve dramatic speeches. They just happened, and the world adjusted quietly around them. Civil rights and social foundations. Then there's Benjamin Harrison, whose efforts to support African American civil rights weren't flashy or successful in his own time, but they planted seeds. He advocated for voting protections and pushed for federal appointments for black leaders. While history didn't crown him a civil rights champion, his actions created precedents. Later leaders built on these foundations. So even though Harrison might not get celebrated on President's Day, the culture of striving for equality in America owes something to his quiet work. Similarly, Grover Cleveland and Calvin Coolidge, through small acts of governance and personal example, helped normalize stability, lawfulness, and moral integrity in government. These values, while subtle, contributed to public expectations of presidential behavior and civic order. The power of quiet leadership. One lesson from these forgotten presidents is simple. Leadership doesn't always have to be loud to matter. Cleveland managed labor strikes without theatrics. Taft promoted diplomacy over war. Garfield warned about corruption before anyone else noticed. Quiet leadership shaped society slowly but surely. These presidents didn't get applause, but they got results that built the frameworks we rely on today. Think about infrastructure, education, diplomacy, or civil rights. Many of these areas benefited from choices made by people who history often overlooked. If a president took a careful, moral, or forward-thinking approach, even small decisions could become cornerstones decades later. Why we forget them, but why are they forgotten? Partly because history loves drama. Presidents who signed iconic bills, led wars, or sparked scandals get headlines. Quiet problem solvers, calm thinkers, and subtle innovators are less memorable, but not less impactful. It's like reading a bedtime story where the hero never shouts but still saves the day. The impact is there. You just need patience to notice it. Remembering these presidents helps us understand history more fully. It reminds us that change isn't always flashy, that courage doesn't always roar, and that leadership isn't only about fame. Some of the most enduring effects come from decisions and principles that weren't applauded at the time. Modern echoes of forgotten choices. Consider modern America. The balance of power between states and the federal government, diplomatic strategies in Latin America and Asia, and the slow progress toward civil rights. All of these reflect actions by presidents like Tyler, Harrison, Cleveland, and Taft, and even Coolidge's restrained fiscal policies influenced attitudes about government spending and private enterprise. Harding's quiet literary and reflective side, often dismissed as irrelevant, reminds us that culture and thoughtfulness matter in leadership too. These legacies aren't always obvious, but they are deeply woven into the fabric of society. Every decision about policy, diplomacy, or leadership style becomes a thread in the tapestry we live with today. Human lessons from quiet leaders. There's also a personal lesson. These presidents weren't perfect. They had quirks, flaws, and occasional missteps. But they show that impact comes from consistency, reflection, and sometimes simply showing up and doing the right thing. Their lives remind us that the quiet, ordinary moments, reading a book, writing a letter, listening carefully, or balancing work with family, can ripple outward in ways we may never see. And it's comforting to know that leadership, at its best, doesn't always require spectacle. Sometimes the best guidance is subtle, considered, and deliberate. A gentle reflection. As we look back, it becomes clear. The forgotten presidents are not failures. They are reminders that history is bigger than headlines, and influence isn't always measured by applause. Polk's expansions, Harrison's moral courage, Garfield's warnings, Taft's diplomacy, Coolidge's calm, these all ripple forward into our lives today. Their actions, small or large, quietly shape the country we live in, and if you listen carefully, their stories offer a lesson in patience, humility, and thoughtful leadership. We often underestimate subtlety. We love drama, noise, and flash, but these presidents prove that steady, thoughtful decisions matter just as much. History may forget their names, but their work remains embedded in the country itself. The calm end of a long journey. Imagine closing a book after reading these stories. Picture the quiet candlelight, the papers stacked neatly on a desk, and a president leaning back in his chair after a long day of choices that will echo for decades. That image captures the heart of what it means to lead quietly. The legacy of the forgotten isn't a single monument or speech. It's the gentle shaping of a nation. Their contributions live in streets, policies, laws, and even attitudes that continue to guide America today. And in that quiet, calm way, we see that history isn't only about the loudest voices. It's also about the ones who worked, thought, and cared enough to make lasting change without needing anyone to notice. So, as you drift off tonight, remember this. Some of the most enduring impacts come from people who were never famous, never flamboyant, and never made the front page. The forgotten presidents remind us that steady hands, quiet courage, and thoughtful choices can shape a nation, and that even small, unseen actions can leave echoes felt for generations.